Okay, so in previous movies we've been taking a look at floating and positioning and seen how we can use those to create some interesting layout effects and interface elements. So before we start, we've swung over into Firefox to take a look at this end result.
You know, Andy, it really is interesting to me as a person who's more technical to imagine how you get from a semantic, unordered list of list items to something so visually beautiful. As a person who is not as strongly visual, I would look at this and I don't see a list. How do you come up with that? What methods do you use? Any kind of tips or tricks for designers?
Well, this particular example, the inspiration came from a magazine. I can't remember which magazine specifically it was. But what interested me about this was the way that the two different background colours on the columns set off the content. It was quite unusual. But when I looked at it, I realised that in essence, it was only just a list. It was a list of people with their pictures and their biographies. So it was sensible to use a semantic unordered list in which to mark it up. Okay, so let's fly back into our text editor. Once again, I'm using Dreamweaver in Code View. And we can see the markup that's been used. Here we have an unordered list. And inside the list, we have 3 list items. Can you notice that I've given each one a unique identifier? 1, 2, and 3. So that we can style those list items independently. And inside that, we have a header level 3 for each of the names, and that includes an anchor, perhaps to their individual biography, and also a portrait.
So in this case, with those header level 3s, obviously this is an example, so it's out of the context of what would be a structured document. You would have an H1 and maybe some H2s there prior to ever seeing those H3s, correct?
That's absolutely right. You also notice that I've used an empty string for the alt text on that image. Obviously, alternative text is very important from an accessibility point of view, but as we've got this image wrapped inside an anchor, and I've added a title attribute to the anchor, it's not really necessary then to repeat that text inside the alternative text for the image. So, let's save this file, whiz back over into Firefox, and take a look at the example with only the browser's default style.
Well, it looks like there's more style to this page. Just to make that clear to everybody that, in fact, there is a global style sheet being applied, but the list, there it is. Now it makes sense to me that this is actually a list of people.
Well, there we can see that we've got markers against each list item. And this is our header level 3, which is a link, and contains an image. So let's start to do some styling. So I'm going to hop back over into Dreamweaver and start to build up the styles. So the first thing I'm going to do is to add some styling for the unordered list. And here what I've done is to remove the default markers, give the list a predefined width, 780 pixels. I've zeroed out the margins and padding and given the list a top border of 20 pixels. So let's save the file, flop back over into Firefox and do a refresh.
Interesting.
Now, we're not going to see much difference at this stage.
Can you address the issue about zeroing out margin and padding? I think a lot of people run into this problem when they work with lists, that they are always confused as to how best to gain control over the way list items work, because list items by default are indented.
That's right. And the other confusing matter is that there's no detail in the specifications as to whether margin or padding should be used on list items. It was up to the browser developers to decide on whether they should use margin or padding for indenting. And, for example, Firefox will use margin, but Internet Explorer will use padding.
Right.
So it's always useful to zero out those margins and padding, and then we can control the effect for each browser. So let's scooter back over into our text editor, and I'm going to now style the list items. Notice here that I've used position relative, so that I can use the list items as new positioning contexts if I want to position any elements inside them. But also, I'm using a float left, and I've given each list item a width. Now, as we've got 3 list items, this will add up to the width of the unordered list. And also, to give the layout a little bit of breathing room, top and bottom, I've added some flexible padding of 2em. So at this point, we'll save the file, ride on back over into Firefox and refresh. And now the thing's starting to come together nicely.
I think this is a great point where we could discuss just how the various learning that we've had up to this point really is starting to take shape. You know, positioning contexts, the idea of floating elements. Suddenly we're seeing how these things work in the context of interface design.
There's still some tidying up to do, so I'm going to fly back over into the editor, and now I'm going to add some styles for the individual list items. So here, for the list item that I've given an ID of 1, I've set a background colour and an image. Notice here that I am using the repeat property for repeat across the horizontal axis, but I've positioned the image to be at the bottom of the list item. So before I go back and preview, I'm going to add the styles for the other 2. Notice that Li2 has no background colour, so that the page background is going to show through. So it's worth looking now, if I save the file, just check up on the progress over in Firefox. You can see the background image that's now been attached to each list item, and the background colours for 1 and 3.
I think this example is particularly good to also show how borders can be used very cleverly to add additional intrigue to various parts of the interface.
Yeah, I mean, the top border on the list item, ordinarily we might need to have used a graphic. In the bad old days, we might have used an entire table row just for creating a coloured top. Crazy. So, 1 or 2 finishing flourishes. We'll style the header level 3s with a little bit of margin and padding, but also I've reduced the font size to match the browser's default font size, so the header won't appear any bigger than the basic fonts on the page. Now, the image, which I've set to float right. Style the paragraphs of text with a little bit of margin and padding. So at this point now we can save the file, ride on back over into Firefox and refresh. And there's the finished result. Interesting interface element from just an unordered list.
And I think this is really a great example of the kind of thinking that we're really trying to encourage designers to begin embracing, where you're looking at the semantic markup, this very minimal markup, a list item, a header, an anchor, an image, suddenly becoming a beautiful interface.